Okay, hello everyone. Today we're going to be talking about how to write a rhetorical analysis essay. A little behind the scenes. I mean, not that you care, but this has taken so many tries to record this lecture. Google Meets, what I've normally been recording with, has been uh, like glitching out on me. So I'm using WeVideo now. So nothing's going to stop me from recording this very important lecture. This is a foundational skill. I mean, the 4 videos before this, very important, but if you can master the skills in this video, you're in a good place to do very well in the class and on the exam. So, with that said, if I'm teaching the class and I give this lecture, I start with this question. Rank these items, these intellectual components, in order of importance. Ideas, scholarly diction, organization, and scholarly syntax. Rank those in order of importance. So take as much time as you need if you've never done this exercise before to do that. You can pause it because I'm going to move forward. In my estimation, based on teaching Lang and based on looking at how a college board expects its scores to score the essays, ideas are valued most, followed by organization, with syntax and diction tied for bronze. But it's the ideas that drive your essays. If you can write something that is grammatically sound and full of pretty elaborate words, fancy words, but if it has no sound, thoughtful ideas behind it, it fails. So what I'm going to teach you is a way to order those ideas that you have as you use SpaceCat to assess text. Whoops. And so our last video was about reading a text and applying the principles of SpaceCat to it. And after you've done that, you should have lots of ideas that you need to express in order to analyze how the speaker achieved his or her purpose, making all those choices and appeals through various tones. So what I'm going to teach you is a structure, not a formula. I define formula as writing that resembles Mad Libs, where you are just told to plug in this item right here in this part of the sentence, comma, plug in this here, comma, plug in this here. There are certain popular ways of writing rhetorical analysis essays that you'll find on the internet that your teachers might use if you take this in other areas, if you're studying this class in different parts of the country that are good. But I think if you do it formulaically, your writing will suffer because you're holding yourself back. And a lot of times students don't even understand why they write it a certain way. And I think holding students to a higher standard is better, results in better writing, more interesting writing a lot of times. So that's my rant about formulaic writing versus structured writing. So at first I wanted to make this a lecture about just essay writing in general, but I'm going to make this specific to rhetorical analysis because I don't think anybody would really spend the time to watch a video just about how to write an essay, period. We're going to make this all about rhetorical analysis, but rhetorical analysis is similar to the synthesis and argument essay in that it is argumentative, in that you have to develop a thesis, you have to take a position, and you have to defend it with evidence and analysis of said evidence to prove your thesis. You have to do that with all 3 of these essays. So while I do plan on doing lectures and discussions about the synthesis essay and the argument, the structure I'm going to show you is applicable, almost identical to what we're going to talk about today with rhetorical analysis. Okay, so about College Board, they've rolled out a new thesis as of this past spring. We used it when we scored the essays online in spring of 2020. Well, it was summer, it was in June. And there were 6 out of 6 points that an essay could earn. 1 point for a defensible thesis, 4 points for how well the thesis was supported with evidence and commentary, and then 1 point awarded if the writing was deemed sophisticated. And I it will get in. I'm probably just going to do an entire lecture about what sophistication is and how to achieve that. But if you write in the way that I'm showing you, your writing will indeed be on the right track to being sophisticated. So don't think of sophistication as certain, as a diction choice or a syntax choice. Think of it more as an expression of ideas. The deeper your ideas are, and the more thoughtful and connected your ideas are, the more sophisticated your writing will be. I'm being vague though, so it'll help once I get into this. It's good to be conventional writing these essays, and I'll encourage you to use a conventional structure simply because so much of doing well on the test is being comfortable with the environment. And if you are comfortable with a set way of responding to an essay, you will just do that much better, as opposed to just always winging it and trying out different ways every time. I mean, there's certain students who are obviously geniuses who could handle that, but for the most part, for most of us, I think it's much more the sounder practice to encourage conventional writing. So today, when I model all these features of a well-written rhetorical analysis essay, we'll be continuing with the Gettysburg Address. Now, if you're not already following along with these notes on your computer, I'd ask you to go ahead and click through in the description on this video and follow along to, we're on slide 7 right now. I've included a link for a sample analysis prompt with using the Gettysburg Address. If you watch the Space Cat video, we use the Gettysburg Address for that. So the idea is we're just having some continuity in the text we're working with, which is something that I think is important. I mean, I know my students, as we study this virtually, are probably sick of Gettysburg right now, but I do think it is valuable to try to do this, to have continuity with text as opposed to just going all over the place as we talk about these kind of new skills for a lot of students. So you've read the Gettysburg Address, you've read the prompt, you've done Space Cat. Now, how do you start writing? Well, first you remind yourself that this essay is about analysis, not summary. Your essay is not going to be a summary of the Gettysburg Address. Everyone knows, or the person scoring your essay knows what the Gettysburg Address is. They know what the text is that you are writing about. So resist the urge to just summarize what the speaker does. You need to explain why it's being done. And it sounds like a very granular distinction, but it's not. And the more you get used to, and the key component in doing that, students are always good at identifying the speaker. And a lot of times students are very quick to pick up on choices as well. But that missing element that's going to make this essay work, and what we'll devote more time in the immediate lecture after this, the skill is thinking about the audience. That's how the analysis clicks. So for an intro paragraph, you need to start with a hook, 1 to 2 sentences, some sort of opening that doesn't flat out restate the prompt. And you can do that in a number of ways. You can start with perhaps a metaphor if you want to be fancy and literary. You can start out by just establishing context or establishing the speaker or the situation. Whatever you use, try not to start with a question, and don't sweat the importance of the intro, the hook, too much, because your score will never hinge on the quality of that. Next, you should have some setup, trying to establish all the aspects of space, the subject, the purpose, the audience, the context, the exigence of this speech or text or letter. Then you need a thesis, 1 to 2 sentences. In order to accomplish his or her purpose, the speaker does this. Do you have to word it that way? No, this is just a formula. Or no, this is just a structure. I'm not giving you a formula. I recommend a closed thesis, meaning you list the items that the speaker does to achieve his or her purpose. And notice I put little asterisks after sentences. The amount that you write can vary depending on the situation, depends on how you write. Some students write with longer, more clause-filled sentences than others. So just know that, again, this is formula, or this is structure, not formula, excuse me. All right, so here is a model intro paragraph with the Lincoln RA. And I give it to you formatted as a big block of text, but if you'll go to the next slide, I break it down from hook, setup, and thesis. For my hook, in 1863, the United States remained embroiled in a bloody civil war between the North and the South. Setup. As President of the United States and head of the Union, Abraham Lincoln had a heavy responsibility in November when he traveled to Gettysburg. He had to memorialize those who died in the extremely bloody battle, but he had to also encourage those hearing the speech at the memorial to continue the Union's efforts against the rebel Confederacy, which would require more blood to be shed. While the speech Lincoln gave at this memorial was brief, its effect was wide reaching. So I've established exigence, a little bit about the audience, those hearing the speech at the memorial, purpose, exigence, audience, context, all that's there. Now, my thesis. In order to memorialize the victims of the Battle of Gettysburg and encourage listeners to support the war efforts, that's his purpose. Lincoln invokes the morals of the founding fathers, downplays his own significance as a civilian, and asserts the need for continued conflict. My Chrome button is covering up that last word. Continued action, excuse me. Okay, another possible intro paragraph could be memorials are often a time to honor past deeds while advancing a plan for the future. This was the case in November of 1863 when President Lincoln traveled to Gettysburg to honor the site of the Civil War's most bloody battle. The Civil War was still raging, and in speaking at this event, Lincoln had a difficult task before him. He had to honor the sacrifice of those who died and were wounded at the battle, but also encourage the speech's audience to support continued action against the Confederacy. To do this, Lincoln gave a brief but impactful speech. In it, he alludes to the country's founding principles, bring together his audience with unifying diction, and offers inspirational slogans. So, in both of these samples I provided, notice with the thesis in the second intro paragraph, the thesis has two sentences, not just one, because I just chose to write it that way. Your thesis doesn't have to be consigned to just one sentence. You should, though, with a thesis, identify what the purpose is, and that purpose should be rhetorical in nature. It should be about convincing, persuading the audience, and then you need to list the choices that are made to achieve that. Okay? All right, so let's try another one. Let's look at another possible intro paragraph. So if you go to slide 13, I do the same thing. I break down the structure of it. Memorials are often a time to honor past deeds while advancing a plan for the future. This was the case in November of 1863 when Lincoln traveled to Gettysburg to honor the site of the Civil War's most bloody battle. The Civil War was still raging, and in speaking at this event, Lincoln had a difficult task before him. He had to honor the sacrifice of those who died and were wounded in the battle, but also encourage the speech's audience to support continued action against the Confederacy. To do this, Lincoln gave a brief but impactful speech. In it, he alludes to the country's founding principles, bring together his audience with unifying diction, and offers inspirational slogans, I think is the word I use. Yeah, inspiring slogans. Few things to note that I do differently. My hook, I think my hook's honestly a little bit better. I'm talking about the genre itself of memorials and speaking at memorials. The thesis, if you note, it's two sentences. It's not one. A thesis does not have to always be one sentence. You probably are taught it in English class as a formulaic one sentence structure. But a thesis for rhetorical analysis just needs to establish what the purpose is and the choices that are made to achieve that purpose. Okay? So before we move on to body paragraphs, one thing to note that you may have noticed, possibly not, it's a kind of a subtle detail, but with rhetorical analysis and when you're writing about literature in general, the verb tense can be kind of weird. If you're writing about the context surrounding a speech or a work of literature, you use the past tense. And if you write about the text itself, you use the present tense. So I illustrate that in the paragraph that I show here. Was, traveled, had to honor, gave a brief but impactful speech. So everywhere where I'm talking about the context of the speech, I'm using the past tense. And when I move to use the talk about the speech itself, alludes, brings together, offers, I use the present tense. One other thing that I want to note before we move forward, and this is probably something that deserves its own lecture outside of this, and I may do that, but as much as possible, I encourage you to work through choices that you identify, work through them in chronological order. So if you see choices that happen early in the speech, identify and analyze that in the first part of your essay. Don't do them out of order, because if you do them in the order in which they appear, it'll make your essay more cohesive and the ideas more cohesive. A science term. We'll have another science term in just a sec, but cohesion is about stickiness, and the same principle applies here. You want your ideas to stick together so that these body paragraphs that we're going to be going over are not uh, they could not be cut up and put out of order and just easily put one after the other. They need to stick together. So if I looked at them separately, I could be like, oh, well, this must be the first body paragraph, and this must be the second body paragraph, because this references this from the first body paragraph, and this references this from the second body paragraph. I feel like I'm ranting, so I will move forward with the structure of the body paragraph. It should have a meaningful transition, a topic sentence, evidence, analysis of the evidence, a second piece of evidence, more analysis, and then synthesis of that. So I give an example, and we'll skip to slide 18 for the breakdown of that body paragraph. Lincoln begins his speech with a reminder of what's at stake, invoking the principles on which America was founded. He references how America was, quote, conceived in liberty, and reminds the audience of fellow Americans of that famous phrase from the Declaration of Independence: all men are created equal. So again, my quote that I provide, or not again, this is the first time you're hearing me do this. This is like the 7th time I've recorded this. My evidence is not just dropped in there. I don't just have a topic or a claim and then just start providing evidence and start shoveling quotes in there without setting them up. I lovingly surround it with my own words. He references how America was, quote, conceived in liberty, and reminds the audience of fellow Americans that famous phrase from the Declaration of Independence. Then I give the quote. Okay. And then my analysis is going to start setting up why it matters to the audience. In doing so, Lincoln establishes a logical justification for almost 3 years of a bloody conflict. By establishing the Civil War as a fight for the principles of freedom for all men, Lincoln also sets an assertive mood to his speech. He's not going to simply mourn what has happened on the battlefield. Additionally, the famous introductory words of the speech, quote, 7 years ago, remind the audience of the relative brief time that has passed since the passage of the Declaration of Independence. And now analysis. In a time of grave civil struggle, Lincoln appeals to the emotions of the audience of mourners in Pennsylvania to think back to another grave but inspiring time in the country's history when a generation was also fighting for essential human rights. And then I synthesize it. I bring these ideas together. The example of the founding fathers, that's the idea that's been present throughout this entire body paragraph, serves as a source of hope, as well as, is that the phrasing I use? As well as a justification for the conflict. So your synthesis can look a lot of different ways, but it should just reference these ideas that you are tying together, so to speak, if that makes sense. Okay? So moving on to a second body paragraph. So here we are in slide 20, where I've broken down that second body paragraph for you. One thing I want you to note, when I was ranting about cohesion earlier, making these ideas stick together. This body paragraph begins, the second body paragraph begins, having now established a logical reason for the death and bloodshed of this battle. So I'm referencing those ideas in that first body paragraph. Lincoln brings together his audience with unifying diction. And now I have established the topic or the claim of this next body paragraph. In the brief second paragraph, he uses the pronoun we 4 times, such as when he says, quote, we are met on a great battlefield of that war. My evidence is again lovingly preceded by my own words, setting it up. I don't just drop it in the cold and then start poking at it with my analysis. I lovingly provide lots of my own setup for those quotes. Then I analyze it. With his use of the first person plural, Lincoln sets himself alongside the rest of the audience. There's the audience. Got to talk about the audience if you're analyzing. Not above them. He feels the same anguish as they do, and therefore the audience is much more likely to be receptive of continued conflict. Pretty persuasive, right? In fact, Lincoln never once uses the pronoun I in the speech. referring to the behaviors of the ceremony with a collective we. Same thing. Lots of loving setup for the evidence that I'm providing. In doing this, Lincoln appeals to the emotions of the audience, framing the struggle of the Civil War as a collective effort and not one that is limited to soldiers, generals, and presidents. Much as the struggles of the founding fathers were depicted in broad terms in the first paragraph, here also Lincoln depicts the war in inclusive language. I'm not going to be able to read the synthesis without dropping back to the prior one. By choosing inclusive diction, all the listeners at the memorial, as well as those who read the speech around the Union, will feel like they have a stake in the war, with the president who considers himself one of them ultimately feeling compelled to support the continued war against the Confederacy. Okay. Question. Why am I saying this? I am losing my mind because I've had to restart recording this. This is literally like the fifth time I've tried to record this thing. This is how much I love uh, talking about rhetorical analysis. And truly, this is not an easy skill to master. And I can't imagine trying to master this skill uh, on your own through online learning. It's tough enough to do it in the classroom where a teacher can answer questions directly. So it's worth it, but I am going to need to do some like guided meditation after I finish making this video. All right, deep breath. Did I talk about the synthesis? Yeah, I synthesized it. So we've done 2 body paragraphs. Now you have to have the choice. Do I do 2 or 3 body paragraphs? Well, if it's an out of class essay, go for 3. You have the time, and the more evidence and analysis you have, the more persuasive your essay is. You have to make a difficult choice if you're doing a timed essay, though. And my advice is to do 2 very comprehensively written body paragraphs, and then to give yourself room for a conclusion. Okay? Because a conclusion, from my observation, is now expected by College Board to earn full points. I'm, I can't really speak about specific essays I read, but based on the models that we were provided by College Board, the vast plurality of the ones that earned full credit in rhetorical analysis had conclusions. Not long conclusions, but they did have a beginning, middle, and end. And I think that's kind of the skill College Board wants to encourage. And I don't think that's a bad skill because it is kind of weird if you just uh, end your essay without concluding it. So disagree with College Board in a lot of things, like we all do, but not for that skill. So have I made that clear? Timed essay, go for 2 body paragraphs unless you're a superhuman writer, genius, and you're rolling that day, go for 3. But for if you're a mortal person like me, just do intro, 2 well-written body paragraphs with a conclusion at the end. However, before we move on to conclusions, let's look at this 3rd paragraph that I went to the trouble of writing so we can admire the cohesion and the way that it is building on these ideas in chronological order. So I analyzed choices made at the beginning of Lincoln's speech. In my first body paragraph, I tackled choices made in the middle of the speech in the second body paragraph. And now with my final body paragraph, I'm tackling those choices made at the end. His audience now on his side, a transition referencing the ideas from the second body paragraph. Lincoln concludes the speech with a forceful call to action. He demands that his audience join him and be, quote, dedicated here to the unfinished work which they who fought here have thus so far nobly advanced, end quote. A lovingly set up quote. Lots of context around it. His impassioned tone would emotionally move the listeners and those subsequently reading the speech to rally for his cause against the Confederates. Indeed, the final sentence is a lengthy but passionate assertion of the, quote, great task remaining before us, end quote. Lincoln saves this demanding request for the finale of his brief speech, and only after he has logically and emotionally prepared his audience to understand why he is asking them to continue supporting a civil conflict that is costing the lives of their fellow countrymen by dramatically raising his passion at the end, he stirs his audience to join him in his call to action. Lots of analysis of that choice tying in to that audience. If I was not explicitly stating who the audience was earlier in the analysis. Boy, I'm doing a lot of it right here, and making sure you leave the essay convinced as much as possible that these choices mattered in achieving Lincoln's purpose with this specific audience. Okay. So now we move forward to conclusions. You should always try to have a conclusion, like I said, and they shouldn't be that long. If you find yourself writing a monster conclusion, and sometimes students realize as they write their conclusion that they had more ideas that they wanted to explore, and their conclusion becomes essentially a hybrid body paragraph slash conclusion. And that happens. Just maybe try to indicate a paragraph break in some form or another when your conclusion starts, because the conclusion should be uh, finalizing and ending your thoughts about the essay. For rhetorical analysis, here are some ways to do it. Reinforce the context and exigence of the speech and why it was so important for these choices to be made. Or describe the effects of the speech if you know anything about the effects of this speech. Or provide a general summation of the choices made and why they were necessary. Or build on a metaphor that was started in the intro paragraph, which would be a fancy and literary approach, but I'm going to try to model that for you. Or a very kind of muted version of that. So here'd be a model of a conclusion. In spite of the violence and horror of war, the president persisted in his desire of the country united under its founding ideals, and he clung to these ideas even in the darkest hours of the country. Lincoln's speech at Gettysburg did indeed help motivate a weary Union in a time of great struggle. By 1864, the Confederate Army surrendered at Appomattox Courthouse, and Lincoln was finally able to reunite a broken country. This is a context-heavy uh, conclusion that draws on the writer, me. It draws on my knowledge of history. And if you're writing an out of class essay, you can research it. Just make sure you cite it. This speaks to the effects of the speech. So, another version of a conclusion. So, remember that intro I wrote that talked about memorials and like the nature of speaking at a memorial? So, this one kind of continues that idea. Memorials are often somber reflections on the past. Lincoln chose his moment at Gettysburg to not just reflect on what has happened, but to use it as a source of inspiration for future action. By honoring the sacrifices of the dead and hearkening to the inspiring founding fathers, Lincoln was able to make the most of his moment at Gettysburg and ultimately lead his Union side to victory. So, like I said, it's continuing those ideas in that specific intro paragraph, which is, in my opinion, that's a very you see that so much in magazine articles and editorials in newspapers. They start with some sort of like motif or hook that they will perhaps reference a few times in their essay, but then just sort of circle back to it at the end. And it's kind of indicating to you, the reader, that this is concluding. I don't have an example of starting and ending with a metaphor. I feel like if you're going to try that, you already know what a metaphor is. And I don't want to like, I mean, I didn't do it in this slide. And yeah, if you're going to try that, you should probably already have the skills to do it. And I don't want to try to model that and make people who it would be irresponsible to do that. Anyway, I give you a link here to well written Lang essays. If you click on this, it will take you to the College Board website, and you can look at all of the past released exams, and you can look at the exam, like the free response questions, and then you can look at student responses to those free response questions. So here's where you could find the 2019 rhetorical analysis essay. It would be at the end. The synthesis is the first question, and that's 8 pages, 6 to 8 pages, and then followed by rhetorical analysis and then argument at the end. So you look at this, then you look at sample response 2. And then it's always fascinating to read the Chief Reader Report. They have lots of interesting comments about common uh, problems students faced in responding to the essay. And maybe it's more interesting for me as an instructor than it would be for you as a student. But it's very helpful for you to go through and read all of the rhetorical analysis essays that were given to students over the past decade. Because if your teacher gives rhetorical analysis timed rights, they're probably going to use one of these from, going back all the way to Well, probably going back to the early 2000s. Uh, if you go back to the those late 90s prompts, are kind of screwy. They threw in some poetry at one point, and but anyway, I'm getting off track. Well, really, it helps to get practice and look at good essays and only look at the good ones. Don't bother looking at the bad ones. There's no point in seeing people fail. Look at what works and what how people have succeeded. So that concludes this presentation about writing a rhetorical analysis essay. This is was supposed to focus on structure. Uh, I plan on devoting an entire lesson or lecture in the next episode to writing effective analysis. But I think it's important to establish how these essays should be structured before uh, before you get started. And I guess I'll end on the note that doing this is both an art and a science. You have to understand intellectually the task before you and be up to that task. But College Board, to get that sophistication point, rewards a certain amount of just uh, cleverness on the part of the writer. But the more intelligent your writing is, the less your writing will have to be flowery in order to earn that sophistication. So I hope this has been helpful for you. My God, the amount of times I've recorded this, it better have been helpful for one person. I swear. I hope this was not a waste of your time. Uh, and I think hopefully, if you have any questions, please contact me in the link or the email that I provide in the description. And obviously, if you're my student, contact me and let me know how I could have made this easier to understand. But it's a difficult essay that this is my third year teaching, and I feel very confident about the way I am teaching it, but it can overwhelm very easily. So in fall of 2020 when I'm talking right now, it's difficult enough, like I said, for students to learn this in person. And I can't imagine how difficult it is to do it on your own. So hopefully this was helpful for you. So I will see you next time. And thanks for watching.